Lord of Mysteries. My Identities Echoes Across Time. Chapter 161 to 170. Afterwards, Alistair Tudor, slightly irritated, thought about sending some sets of clothes to Bethel's child. He restrained his urge to manually make the other person's clothes asymmetrical. The impact brought by switching to a non-neighboring pathway was enormous. If the original Alistair Tudor was steady, calm, rigorous, and patient, the Blood Emperor now lacked these qualities. The internal conflict of different Beyonder characteristics made Tudor endure a certain desire for destruction every second. He became cruel, impulsive, extreme, and hysterical. He could no longer patiently think as he used to. Controlling the desire for slaughter and madness in front of his subjects had already exhausted most of the Blood Emperor's remaining sanity. So now, the Blood Emperor lacked patience for most things. Only the kings of angels of the three families and matters related to them could make Tudor more rational and patient. So pathetic, Lynn said silently, without a trace of sympathy in his eyes. No matter how pitiful the Blood Emperor was, he brought it upon himself. If anyone was to be pitied, it was his little red more so. Thinking this, Lynn took half a step back, avoiding the cloak thrown at him. He could certainly put on that cloak and act as an obedient sequence too, but Lynn suddenly didn't feel like doing so. Don't ask why, just seeing the Blood Emperor put him in a very bad mood. As for the consequences, the worst outcome would be this Smurf account being wasted, which Lynn could bear. Moreover, a Sequence 0, even with Amon and Antigonus added, didn't have the ability to waste Lynn's Smurf account. Lynn indeed didn't want to borrow the power of Great Old Ones or above. Even Sequence 0 powers differed. A newly promoted Sequence 0 was called Sequence 0, and a digested Sequence 0 was also called Sequence 0, but a double Sequence 0 was still Sequence 0. Although the more power he borrowed, the greater the side effects for Lynn, as long as it didn't reach the Great Old One level, he could bear it. Moreover, if things really got bad, he could always run to the Solomon Empire and seek refuge with Ouroboros. As long as he didn't see the true creator, he could pretend the other didn't exist. Alistair Tudor's eyes narrowed at this, but before he could take action, Bethel already moved. Sorry, Your Majesty, Libert is rather shy, and your actions probably scared him, Bethel said, without blinking, while picking up the cloak from the ground and handing it back to Tudor, adding, he also doesn't like wearing other people's clothes, so your kindness can only be declined. Naturally, Tudor did not take the cloak back from Mr. Dorr. His blue eyes swept over Lynn before landing on Bethel, saying, You seem to pamper this child. No, Your Majesty, I'm not pampering him, I'm just afraid he'll beat you to death. Bethel retorted silently in his heart, but outwardly remained solemn and serious, saying, Libert is a good child. As for whether he was his child, he had never acknowledged it directly. Perhaps, Alistair Tudor said, his gaze falling on the cloak in Bethel's hand, and commanded, Dispose of it. At these words, without any visible action from the Mr. Dorr, the cloak vanished as if it had never appeared. Alistair Tudor then sat down at the head of the round table. As soon as he sat, attendants naturally served him tea and water. He looked at the still-standing group. Although he vaguely sensed something was off, the half-crazed Blood Emperor was too lazy to think about it, speaking coldly, Why aren't you sitting? As he spoke, an aura of blood and fire began to emanate from him, suggesting that he might force them to sit if they didn't comply. Half-crazed people couldn't be expected to be rational, especially as Tudor was now a Red Priest, enhancing his close combat abilities. Although he might not be as specialized as the Red Angel, he was still one of the top figures in the 22 pathways. At least among the three families, if unprepared, they stood no chance against Tudor in close combat. And indeed, the Blood Emperor's usual strategy towards the three families was, beat whoever jumps. Yet no one moved. Amon was happy to watch the drama, hoping Lynn would fight Tudor, so he naturally wouldn't step in to ease the tension. Antigonus secretly glanced at Lynn and then at Tudor. He claimed he didn't want to reveal his peculiarity in front of Tudor, yet here he was, clearly doing so. Antigonus couldn't help but inwardly complain, but the timid demonic wolf dared not act. If anyone could break the deadlock, it would be Bethel, the one least wanting the situation to escalate, and the only one who might persuade Lynn. After agreeing to ambush Tudor together and inciting each other to persecute others, the relationship between Mr. Dorr and Lynn had subtly improved, becoming closer friends. So now, already feeling a headache, Bethel was prepared to bear the maintaining peace responsibility and smooth things over. But before he could speak, Lynn patted his shoulder. Bethel swallowed his words. "Can I choose my own seat?" Lynn walked to the round table, smiling, though the smile was colder and more formal than usual. As he spoke, Lynn was ready. If Tudor attacked, he had a surprise for him. Tudor's gaze fell on Lynn. Even in his semi-rational state, the Blood Emperor realized the source of the three families' unusual behavior today. This instinctively irritated him, but he still nodded. "You may." "Thank you." Lynn thanked politely, then sat opposite Alistair Tudor, signaling the three behind him, cheerfully saying, "Why are you standing? Sit down." At his words, Amon, eager to stir trouble, immediately sat beside Lynn. Antigonus hesitated for half a second before apologetically smiling at Tudor and also sitting next to Lynn. Lastly, Mr. Dorr, Bethel, clearly helpless with the situation, rationally chose the seat closest to Lynn. This was the most suitable position for him, the best place to act before things got worse. Caught between two people, Mr. Dorr was very helpless. This was an unprecedented scene in the fourth epic. The nearby attendants wished they could lower their heads to their knees. They didn't know what the Empire's noble families were up to, but they knew they couldn't get involved. End of chapter. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. The atmosphere in the small garden was unprecedentedly tense. The scent of blood and fire had already permeated the air, and it seemed that a battle of Sequence 0 level would erupt at any moment. "Are you going to betray me?" Alistair Tudor's blue eyes swept over Amon, Antigonus, and Mr. Dorr, his aura growing increasingly cruel and insane. Facing Alistair Tudor's questioning, the three kings of angels of the three pathways glanced at each other, but no one explained. Instead, Lynn smiled and said, "You misunderstand, they have no intention of betraying you." As he finished speaking, Lynn waved to a nearby servant and said, "Please pour me a cup of tea, thank you." He looked like a polite and gentle young man. The named servant was stunned, looking up almost helplessly, unsure of whether he should act. Although being able to serve the Blood Emperor made the servant somewhat of a trusted aide, his sequence wasn't high enough to dare to interfere in a confrontation between the Blood Emperor and the three kings of angels. "Pour him tea," Alistair Tudor ordered coldly. "Yes, Your Majesty." The servant quickly stepped forward to pour tea for Lynn, and also poured tea for the kings of angels of the three pathways. After that, the servant quickly retreated to his original position, continuing to bow his head deeply, pretending to be an ostrich, hearing and seeing nothing. Lynn leisurely took a sip of his tea before speaking slowly. "Amon is purely fanning the flames. For him, it's best if you and I fight here. But he won't easily abandon you. After all, he and his brother have invested too much in you, so you should have more confidence in this regard." Alistair Tudor said nothing in response, only looking at Amon. The latter, unperturbed at having his thoughts exposed, smiled and said, "I'm just very curious about what kind of confidence you have, Libert. Then you'll probably have to wait a long time to find out." Lynn smiled as he put down his teacup. Although he was talking to Amon, his gaze was on Alistair Tudor. "Just relying on Alistair Tudor is not enough to make me reveal my true cards." As soon as these words were spoken, flames erupted in the garden, not metaphorically, but real flames rose from the air. "Ah, you half-mad guys, so quick to explode. The Giant King was like this, and so are you." Lynn thought of a certain Giant King who attacked him just for looking at him, making his mood even worse. At the same time, he raised his hand and snapped his fingers. Snap. The flames in the garden extinguished simultaneously. No, it might be more accurate to say that time in the entire garden rewound to before the flames ignited. Sure enough, a fight was inevitable. Seeing this familiar scene, Bethel could only sigh helplessly. He knew that since Lynn had used the power of time, it was clearly impossible to wait until the next tea party to deal with Tudor. Bethel's only hope now was that Lynn would keep his word and just beat Tudor up rather than kill him. While praying inwardly, Mr. Dorr made a move, and the space of the small garden solidified at that moment. Then the entire space was cut out, forming an isolated space. "Sorry, Emperor Tudor, this is for your own good," Bethel said apologetically. Alistair Tudor immediately looked at him, a flame spear already forming in his hand, seemingly wanting to attack Mr. Dorr or forcefully break through this space. "Don't be angry, Tudor. If anyone here genuinely cares about you, it's probably only Bethel." Lynn spoke at this moment, still sitting there with a teacup in hand, seemingly ignoring the battle already unfolding around him. He continued leisurely, "He's just afraid I'll kill you, so he's standing on my side to dissuade me at a critical moment. If he chose you, I wouldn't listen to his advice." From this perspective, Bethel is indeed the conscience of the Tudor Empire's three pathways. Lynn even gave a thumbs up to Mr. Dorr. "This is not a compliment I want," Bethel said helplessly, dodging the flame spear that was originally aimed at him. Naturally, the attack wasn't limited to Mr. Dorr alone, but the three pathways were adept at dodging, if not confronting directly. Antigonus is simple, he's just plain scared. Lynn smiled and then drank the tea in his cup. Lynn didn't make any other moves, yet the flames exploding beside him seemed to be in a different time zone, not even touching the hem of his clothes, let alone causing any harm. This scene naturally fell into the eyes of others in the garden. Bethel wasn't surprised. He had witnessed Lynn's battle with the Mother Tree of Desire, so he knew that fighting Lynn without time and space authority was essentially futile. One cannot harm an entity not in the same time as oneself. The Mother Tree of Desire had fought Lynn for a long time to no avail, being hammered unilaterally by Lynn without causing him any harm. Bethel speculated that perhaps someone could break this deadlock with extraordinary abilities without mastering time and space authority, but it would at least have to be an above-the-sequence level existence, not sequence 0 or below. Amon, for once, showed a serious expression. Theoretically, as the Worm of Time, he possessed some time authority, but not to Lynn's extent. And, besides the Lord of Mysteries, was there another ancient being with time abilities? The only one Amon could think of was the Key of Light, which was clearly unlikely. Antigonus, showing as expected, expression, wasn't surprised by Lynn's mastery of time authority, having already known Lynn could alter the past. Better follow Lynn to beat Tudor, Antigonus now firmly held his belief. If he had any reservations before the battle, now he had none. End of chapter. Alistair Tudor was evidently the most surprised by the scene before him. However, as a half-crazed god, he felt neither fear nor hesitation. His sole thought was to continue attacking and utterly crush his opponent. It must be said, this was quite straightforward. So aggressive. Lynn put down the teacup and finally stood up. He still wore a smile, but it was colder and less gentle than usual, showing more arrogance. After all, at this moment, Lynn was no longer just himself, he had once again become him. The small space that had been separated out had turned into a sea of fire. Not only that, but lightning and storms also descended, bringing natural disasters. The separated space began to show cracks. If Bethel hadn't been fortifying it while dodging attacks, it would have completely shattered by now. Finally, it's my turn. You might think I'm here to kill you, but my intentions are quite simple. Lynn smiled as he spoke, taking a step forward. In that instant, time froze, but only for everyone except Lynn. In this otherworldly space, the flames, the storm, everything vanished in an instant, even the flowers destroyed in the battle returned to their original blooming state before the fight began. In the next second, Lynn appeared before Alistair Tudor and said earnestly, "I just wanted to ambush you and take a piece of your weather warlock characteristic." After all, revenge wasn't his concern, it would be better for Little Red to do it personally in the future. Lynn didn't want to completely break off with Bethel, Amon, and Adam now. Alistair Tudor, being a sequence 0, wasn't easy to kill. Although Lynn could imprison him like a chicken, this imprisonment couldn't last long. Without using powers of the Great Old One, it wasn't easy to kill a sequence 0. The authority over time was strong, but it couldn't easily kill a true god of the same level. If it came to a desperate fight, Lynn would still face some difficulties. The frozen Alistair Tudor naturally couldn't respond to Lynn. His brutal and crazed blue eyes slowly formed a question mark. With such a big commotion, even his confidants were turned against him, and now you tell me you just want to beat me up. Even though half-crazed, Alistair Tudor found this too ridiculous. So don't resist. If you don't, you'll just get beaten. If you do, you might get seriously injured. Lynn didn't care what Alistair Tudor thought. He just smiled and said domineering words. Then, a sack appeared in Lynn's hand, which he used to cover Tudor's upper body. Next, Lynn looked at the three escaping kings of angels, smiling, if you don't fight, I'll beat you too. In the next second, the frozen time resumed, and the kings of angels exchanged glances. Finally, Antigonus was the first to pull out historical projections from the air. The seer's dual nature was vividly displayed in Antigonus. Sorry, Tudor, getting beaten is the best outcome compared to falling. Bethel said, as the authority over sealing flashed. Just freed from the time freeze, Alistair Tudor found part of his abilities temporarily sealed. In the next moment, Amon extended his hand, and a flame spear identical to the one in Tudor's hand solidified in his grip. Amon adjusted his monocle and smiled. Actually, I've wanted to do this for a long time, Your Majesty. At that moment, Alistair Tudor's confidants officially became his biggest threats. What do I do? His Majesty Tudor is fighting Duke Amon and the others. Should I run away while I still can? The lone attendant in the original small garden paced back and forth anxiously. It was clear his anxiety had reached the extreme. Not running away immediately was a significant restraint. Because the space was cut off at the start of the battle, the people of the palace hadn't yet noticed the fight. Of course, even if someone noticed, there was little they could do. After all of the high-end combat power of the Tudor Empire was in this battle. This was why the attendant didn't run to notify others. Who could he notify? Even the Sequence 2 adults would only meet their death against His Majesty Tudor, Duke Bethel, Duke Amon, and Duke Antigonus. So, the attendant could only anxiously wait for the battle to end, praying it was just another daily skirmish among the lords. But rationally, the attendant knew this was unlikely. Though His Majesty Tudor often beat other lords, this time was different. Perhaps today would rewrite the history of the Tudor Empire, and my fate ends here, the attendant thought gloomily. Then, the separated space suddenly returned, startling him. He looked up and wished he hadn't. He saw the three angel kings looking refreshed, as if they had vented their anger. Meanwhile, their supreme ruler, His Majesty Alistair Tudor, sat there with a cold face. His Majesty Tudor's expression was as cold, brutal, and crazed as ever, but now with a few bumps on his head, blackened eyes, and a face clearly battered. Even His Majesty Tudor's clothes had been changed to a symmetrical style he hated, with a sack-like thing over him. I'm doomed, thought the attendant. Then, he heard His Majesty's cold voice, who are you really? I am Libert Abraham. The boy, said to be the son of Mr. Dorr, answered with a smile. HMPH. His Majesty Tudor didn't believe a word. The boy continued, I know you're upset about being beaten, but I enjoy seeing you angry yet unable to beat me. If you want to try again, feel free, but... The boy's tone turned cold. Next time, I might not stop with just a sequence too characteristic. The attendant wished he could plug his ears. As he thought he was surely dead, he heard the boy's cheerful voice, by the way, this attendant is interesting. Why not give him to me? He can be a spy. All right. The attendant heard His Majesty's cold voice. Although it felt disloyal, the attendant couldn't help but breathe a sigh of relief. Thank goodness, I'm alive. End of chapter. Setting aside how complicated the waiter's feelings were, after beating Alistair Tudor and obtaining a weather warlock's characteristic from him, Lynn was in a rather good mood. Especially when looking at the Blood Emperor who, although seething with rage, could only sit quietly. This made Lynn even happier. Tudor naturally wanted to make a move, but he was only half mad, not completely insane. After experiencing Lynn's strength in the alternate space, the few rational thoughts left to this Sequence 0 reminded him that if he made another move, he might really die. The opponent was undoubtedly more powerful, at least a dual pathway true god if not an great old one. Though it might come at a significant cost, the opponent could kill him. And as someone who had jumped sequences recklessly to survive, Tudor was unwilling to die in such an unclear manner. So, despite his anger, Tudor suppressed his fury, only growing more desperate for ascension. If he could devour the primordial demoness. Various mad thoughts flashed through Tudor's mind when the young man before him suddenly smiled and said, "By the way, Tudor, you must have had important matters to discuss when you called Bethel and the others for this tea party, right? Why not start now?" The young man's voice was as gentle as always, as if genuinely making a suggestion. Hearing this, the round table under Alistair Tudor's hands crumbled into powder. His blue eyes swept over the King of Angels, who had reverted from a serious threat to a concern. Coldly, he said, "No need, there's nothing to discuss." The initial purpose of the tea party was to understand the situation with Amon and Bethel's mission to the Balaam Empire and to meet the son of Mr. Dor who had recently emerged. But now, discussing these matters was pointless. Tudor had exhausted his patience, and as for Mr. Dor's son. Tudor glanced at the seemingly ordinary young man who looked like a Sequence 2 angel, making it hard to believe such a gentle and naive-looking guy was a true god or even more powerful. Even after battling him, Tudor couldn't determine the pathway of the opponent. That helpless time-manipulating ability. Alistair Tudor's blue eyes showed rare contemplation, but he couldn't align any pathway with Lynn's abilities even after much thought. Tudor decided to stop thinking about it. Regardless of the opponent's pathway, although they held some malice towards him, they didn't intend to kill him directly. And this was his opportunity. "Good luck," Alistair Tudor heard the young man say with a smile, looking at him as if he understood exactly what he was thinking, and added, "I suggest you cooperate with Amon. He has quite a few issues with me too." The young man seemed completely unconcerned about Alistair Tudor's hostility. And Lynn truly didn't care. He had anticipated Tudor's change in attitude before making his move. But what did it matter? Whether Alistair Tudor had hostility towards him didn't affect Lynn's desire to beat him up. He didn't care about the enmity of a Sequence 0. When Lynn decided to provoke Amon, he didn't expect this identity to live peacefully. Now, it was just one more person annoyed with him. The worst-case scenario would be the loss of this Smurf account, which Lynn could handle. Besides, Tudor and the others were unlikely to destroy this Smurf account easily. Conversely, killing Tudor would require excessive force, risking self-assimilation and deteriorating relations with Bethel and others, which wasn't worth it for Lynn. He knew that this lesson would make Tudor hesitant to attack him easily again. He was only half mad, not fully insane, and wouldn't risk his life recklessly. Thus, Alistair Tudor's hostility was of little consequence to Lynn. Moreover, Lynn enjoyed seeing people who wanted to kill him but couldn't, making it easier for him to beat them up whenever he wanted. If they were dead, there would be no fun. In a way, Lynn had a very nasty personality. "Libert, your words really hurt me. Though I am curious about your trump card, I still consider us friends," Amon said, adjusting his crystal monocle, seeming somewhat saddened. "Perhaps you need to have your brain checked," Lynn responded seriously, glancing at Amon. "Do you have a suitable doctor to recommend?" Amon asked earnestly, seemingly unaffected by Lynn's sarcasm. This made Lynn's expression turn subtle. He looked at the friendly Amon and, after thinking for a moment, said, "You acting normal scares me." Amon's smile stiffened slightly. Seeing this, Lynn appeared relieved, even patting his chest and saying, "Good, good. Your brain isn't damaged. If you turned into a good kid, I might hesitate to deal with you in the future." Though he said this, Lynn knew why Amon's attitude changed. It was due to the recognition of his strength during their fight, prompting Amon to ease their relationship. This wasn't surprising since they had no deep-seated hatred, and Amon, who appeared adventurous but was actually cautious, wouldn't let their relationship deteriorate upon realizing Lynn's capability to suppress Sequence 0's. Unfortunately, Lynn didn't buy it. He seriously said to Amon, "Let's continue our mutual dislike. It will make it easier for me to torment you without any guilt. Don't worry, I won't really harm you, considering Saucereer. Just some pranks. As the god of mischief, you shouldn't mind, right?" Amon's smile stiffened more, but being Amon, he quickly adjusted, smiling and saying, I'm looking forward to exchanging pranking experiences with you, Libert. End of chapter. As he spoke, Amon's mind was racing. By now, Amon had basically determined that Libert Abraham was an unknown ancient god, but one thing particularly caught Amon's attention. Why was Libert, as an ancient god, acting as Mr. Dor's son and not taking action during the previous punishment? Amon was never foolish. On the contrary, he was a very intelligent king of angels. So after a brief thought, Amon came to a hypothesis. Libert Abraham might indeed be an ancient god, but his condition was evidently not good. Amon had to admit, this was a relief. An ancient god in a poor condition was always easier to deal with than one at their peak. Besides this, what concerned Amon more was Libert Abraham's attitude. The other party was clearly targeting him because of Mediche, and the reason the other party hadn't taken lethal action, but kept toying with him, was likely because of Saussure. Maybe I should ask Adam, that lunatic might know something about this. Amon thought, though he kept a calm exterior. Lynn didn't care what Amon thought or whether some Adam might know of his existence. After all, he was just playing his part in this disguise. Therefore, Lynn looked at Alistair Tudor and smiled. If there's nothing else, I'll take my leave, Your Majesty Tudor. I look forward to our next meeting. By the way, the tea was nice. Even though he used respectful terms and didn't have any mocking tone, coming from a teenager, the words sounded inexplicably infuriating. This time, the chair under Tudor turned to powder, but as a dignified sequence 0, he naturally didn't fall to the ground, still maintaining his original posture, just sitting on air. Your Majesty, I beg my leave as well, Bethel spoke up then, naturally not intending to leave the young man alone, following him instead. You all get out, Tudor finally spoke, his voice as cold as ice, sharp as if mixed with knives. I will compile the important details of this visit to the Balaam Empire and present them to you later, Your Majesty. Goodbye. Amon adjusted his monocle and then disappeared into the air. Of course, no one knew how much Amon was left in the air at that moment. Then I'll take my leave too. Goodbye. Antigonus, naturally not intending to stay under these circumstances, still remembered Lynn's promise to pet his head, so he dared not leave directly, following behind Lynn and Mr. Dor instead. Incidentally, the servant whom Lynn had taken along hesitated for a second before firmly following Lynn. Soon, the small garden quieted down again. Alistair Tudor sat there silently, the air around him gradually filling with a faint smell of rust. Lynn and his party quickly returned to the Abraham family residence. The butler had already been waiting at the door. Upon seeing Lynn and Mr. Dor return, he sighed in relief, smiling with joy. His gaze then fell on Antigonus beside them, showing some vigilance and confusion. It was evident that the superficial camaraderie between Antigonus and Bethel wasn't a recent development. Mr. Butler. Lynn greeted the butler cheerfully, then pushed the shy-looking servant next to him forward, smiling. This is a servant His Majesty Tudor gave me. What's your name again? Lynn suddenly realized he didn't know the servant's name and turned to ask. Doug Jones. My name is Doug Jones, the servant quickly replied. Doug Jones. Interesting name, Lynn mused, stroking his chin, then continued to the butler. Mr. Butler, can you find a job for Doug Jones? Preferably one by my side. The reason Lynn took the servant was twofold. 1. Considering Alistair Tudor's personality, he would likely kill the servant to silence him, so Lynn took him along to save him, and 2. He found this person somewhat interesting. Someone who was so clearly cowardly, yet managed to stay by Alistair Tudor's side without fleeing during a crisis, was quite intriguing. Lynn thought that having such a person around might bring some amusement in the future. As for whether the servant would betray him out of loyalty to Alistair Tudor, Lynn wasn't too concerned. He believed in his ability to win people's hearts. Since birth, anyone Lynn wanted to win over, he managed to. Lynn knew he had a peculiar talent in this area. Ads by PubFuture. A servant given by His Majesty Tudor. Hearing this, the butler's gaze immediately scrutinized the servant, clearly uneasy and prejudiced against a servant given by Tudor. But the butler didn't argue with Lynn's request. Smiling, he said, Of course, Master Libert, I will arrange something suitable for him. As a butler, he knew his duty well. Since the young master wanted this servant by his side, he he wouldn't oppose it. However, how to investigate and ensure that this potential threat to the young master became a loyal guard dog was his concern. The servant, who had been deeply bowing his head, suddenly shivered for no apparent reason. Lynn naturally noticed the butler's thoughts and, sharing the same concerns, didn't intervene. He then looked at Antigonus and said, "Let's go to my room later. I know you're scared, so we'll make it quick." Antigonus wanted to say he wasn't scared, but ultimately didn't speak, only nodding stiffly. After witnessing how easily Lynn subdued Alistair Tudor, the violent Blood Emperor, Antigonus naturally feared Lynn more. At this point, he almost equated Lynn with his deepest fears, thinking only of returning to the nation of Evernight as soon as possible after Lynn was done with him. This time, he would stay hidden for a good 10 years or more, unless absolutely necessary. Hearing their conversation, the butler was puzzled but didn't inquire further. Bethel, meanwhile, rubbed his temples and said, "Take this guy away first. There's no need for you to get involved in the rest. I'll come to you later about the family's affairs. Be prepared." "Yes, Lord Bethel," the butler responded respectfully and left with the bewildered Doug Jones. Lynn, Antigonus, and Bethel quickly arrived at Lynn's room. The human-shaped Antigonus disappeared, replaced by a large wolf that looked even bigger than an adult, demonic wolf. Lynn finally got to pet Antigonus's head. In his subsequent diary, he recorded the event as follows. X year X month X day, today was a good day. Not only did I thoroughly beat up Alistair Tudor, but I also got to pet Antigonus's wolf head. I must say, little Antigo's head feels much better than Evernight's. The fur is especially soft, like a puppy's fluff. I suspect little Antigo adjusted the feel of his fur intentionally, very considerate. Though he trembled a lot. Seriously, just because I considered turning him into a pet dog, he gets this scared. Puzzling. End of chapter. After successfully petting Antigonus's head, Lynn saw off the seemingly terrified little Antigo brand demonic wolf, whose mind was likely filled with thoughts of fleeing. He then bid farewell to Mr. Door, who appeared hesitant to speak. Finally, with a click, he closed the door. Woo! Leaning against the door, Lynn exhaled softly and then smiled. He took out the characteristics of the weather warlock he had extracted from Alistair Tudor. Little Red, I'm truly worried about you. You should serve as my tool for 10,000 years. Lynn played with the characteristics in his hand, speaking to himself silently. The reason he took the opportunity to forcibly extract the characteristics of the weather warlock from Tudor was not a spur-of-the-moment decision. Lynn had planned this long ago, partly because merely defeating the Blood Emperor felt insufficiently satisfying, and partly to prepare for Mediche. Lynn's second Smurf account was created in the wrong era, making it impossible for him to change Medice's fate of being hot in a pot right now. However, this didn't mean Lynn could do nothing. For instance, although Lynn couldn't change Medice's fate, he could now find a sequence too characteristic for Mediche, helping a certain evil spirit gain some self-preservation ability within the limits before his fate was rewritten, to prevent any tragic events. Lynn could have done this in the fifth epic, but in that era, the seven gods had already taken their positions. Without useful tools like Mr. Door or Saucereer by his side, finding a sequence too characteristic would be far more difficult than in the fourth epic. Moreover, the stronger Mediche is in the fifth epic, the more he can help Lynn later. While relying on a King of Angels level tool might be out of the question for now, given the current situation in the fifth epic, an angel level tool would suffice. At the same time, this will also allow me to verify in real time how major changes in others' fates manifest in the future. It's quite exciting. Lynn chuckled softly. At the same time, in the fifth epic, after listening to Klein's story of the past and sending him out of the house with the excuse of wanting to be alone, Lynn's main body closed the door. His divine persona suddenly reappeared beside him. It's time to meet Mediche. I hope they like the surprise I brought, Lynn said. Then, as if remembering something, he smiled at his divine persona and added. And I need to rehearse the script with Little Red. They are now the only one who knows the truth, and likely will remain the only one. If we don't rehearse, I might get killed later. You're overthinking it. From a practical standpoint, even combined, the six gods can't defeat you. The divine persona spoke dispassionately, naturally reflecting Lynn's own control. This was partly because this rascal's inner drama was surfacing again, but also because Lynn wanted to get used to this dual persona situation, aiming to maintain the separation between his Smurf accounts and main body even when no one was watching. This way, he was least likely to slip up. That's true, but that power doesn't truly belong to me. Strictly speaking, it is mine, Lynn said with a self-deprecating smile. The more I use this power, the closer I get to my true self. If I let myself indulge in it, even without overusing the power, the cumulative aftereffects would eventually drag me into the abyss. That's why you hit Alistair Tudor hard, so that they would be most fearful and least likely to make a move, saving you a lot of trouble later, the divine persona stated calmly, continuing to outline the facts. Actually, the optimal solution was never to provoke them from the start. Whether it was Amon or Alistair Tudor, if you had simply kept your identity as Mr. Door's son, they wouldn't have done anything to you. Yeah, Lynn nodded slightly. He looked at his divine persona, observing the part of his will within it. It was the same will he used to control his other Smurf accounts, only influenced by the divine persona's accumulated divinity, making it think more coldly, more like his early self. Ads by PubFuture. This was undeniably an interesting experience. From the perspective of Lynn's main consciousness, he could clearly perceive himself thinking in two different ways simultaneously. One was his usual way of thinking, and the other was influenced by the divinity, colder and closer to his former self. But this wasn't disjointed, nor did it give Lynn a feeling of impending split personality. Rather, it felt oddly familiar, as if he had long been accustomed to this split yet unified way of thinking. Considering his true form and his knack for creating Smurf accounts, perhaps it wasn't surprising. He might indeed be a habitual offender in this regard. Lynn mused, then smiled and said, but that would be boring. Living purely for profit is too dull. This was, of course, an answer to his divine persona, or rather, a self-question and answer. Life is interesting because you get to meet all kinds of people, experience various emotions from them, and get involved in all sorts of things due to these emotions. Lynn declared, beaming. He loved experiencing different emotions, and constantly seeking fun was part of that. For Lynn, avenging important family members was something he had never experienced before coming to this world, and that made him very eager to experience it. And as it turned out, avenging someone important was indeed immensely satisfying. Besides, Lynn added as if he had learned something new, beating Amon is so enjoyable. Even without Little Red, I would still beat him up. Otherwise, I'd feel so cheated I wouldn't be able to sleep. You should let Amon hear that. He'd be thrilled. The divine persona finally smiled with emotion. So better not tell him. Let him think it's all Medice's fault. This way, at least he'll hold onto some hope for reconciliation. Lynn said, patting his non-existent conscience and sighing, I really am a good person. The divine persona didn't comment on Lynn's truth. Instead, it opened a door and said, let's go. End of chapter. In the fourth epic, Lynn's second Smurf account also left the Abraham family's residence. He was going to meet the Mediche of this era, who had just recently become an evil spirit, and give him a gift. Inside the underground ruins, Mediche raised his eyes to look at the space door that had just opened in front of him, raising his eyebrows as he already guessed who the visitor was. After all, in this era, the only people who would come to see him as an evil spirit, apart from the descendants of the Tudor family he controlled, would be a certain heartless brother. As it turned out, Medice's guess was right. Lynn walked out of the space door, but what surprised Mediche a little was that another person followed behind him, someone who looked exactly like Lynn and had the same aura. Lynn, did you finally lose your patience and split yourself in half? How should I address you two now, Lynn A and Lynn B? Or do you want to imitate Amon? I'm afraid you don't have that talent because you don't have his brain. Medice's tone was immediately sarcastic. As a former king of angels, he naturally realized right away that the other person was Lynn's avatar. However, what made Mediche slightly wary was that Lynn's new avatar felt very peculiar, not like an ordinary avatar. You can call me Lynn, and call him Angel of Secrets, Lynn responded with a smile, retorting without hesitation, and frankly, having avatars in this world is quite normal. There are many big shots with Smurf accounts. But, Little Red, you are unique in merging 3 accounts into one. Lynn was not afraid to poke at Medice's sore spot. After all, he would change this history sooner or later, and he had just helped Little Red defeat the Tudors, giving him some confidence. Hey, I should have inherited the Sage's characteristics while you inherited the Weather Warlock's characteristics. Medice's expression turned ugly. Being turned into a hot pot was a lifelong pain and humiliation for him. If he were still a king of angels, Mediche might have been able to control his emotions better and not be easily provoked by such topics. But now Mediche was an evil spirit, and being able to maintain his sanity was already thanks to Adam's silent manipulation. You can't expect an evil spirit to control their emotions well. Mediche not losing his mind and refraining from wanton malice was already a good result. It's better not to. I'm afraid we both wouldn't achieve much, and that would be terrifying, Lynn said seriously, leaving people unsure whether to admire his self-awareness or see it as more sarcasm. However, before Mediche could speak sarcastically again, Lynn preemptively said, I saw Alice de Tudor. What? Medice's words of provocation that were on the tip of his tongue were immediately forgotten. He almost instantly became energetic, no longer lazy, and even the 2 scars on his face seemed to become active. Is he still alive? Medice's look at Lynn was somewhat terrifying, but not directed at Lynn, rather at a certain man who had been dead for countless years. Evidently, although he knew of Lynn's special nature, as a mythological creature from a time with normal flow and no changes before Lynn's arrival, Medice's first reaction was not that Lynn saw Tudor in the past, but suspicion that the long-dead Tudor might have survived. This is not surprising. Creatures have inertia in their thinking, and Sequence 0 beings are not easily killed. While Red Priest is not as hard to kill as the 3 families Sequence 0's, it's not impossible for him to have some contingency to survive. This is common knowledge among big shots in this world. High sequences are hard to kill, and the higher the sequence, the harder it gets. When it reaches the level of great old ones like the Lordofthemysteries and the God Almighty, they can teach you in person what it means to still be able to resurrect in you after being dead for countless years. Mediche himself is a witness to this. Though he was turned into hot pot, lost his characteristics, and became an evil spirit, he still survived, retaining his rank. Otherwise, Mediche could not have used the unowned Red Priest uniqueness to respond to prayers, and in the later stages of the story, directly take and consume the Conqueror characteristics traded by the Demoness sect and the Augustus family, regaining the Sequence 1 Conqueror status, even attempting to devour the primordial Demoness, although he got betrayed by Amon again. Such experiences made Medice's first reaction to Lynn's words naturally suspect that Tudor survived by some means. Honestly, in this era, I'm not sure if Tudor is still alive. But I didn't say I saw him in this era, Lynn said unhurriedly, shaking his head while looking at Mediche, smiling. Remember I said I would change your fate. You. Mediche instantly realized something, his blood-red pupils slightly dilating. But the next second, Lynn's words made the hotpot evil spirit almost stage a brotherly brawl on the spot. However, I'm sorry to say, I did not succeed in returning to the time before your fall, Lynn said, his smile fading as he sincerely apologized. Mediche, can you stop with the suspense? Mediche was speechless, but at the same time, as a cunning conspirator, he had already guessed the follow-up to Lynn's words. So Mediche said, you said you didn't manage to return before my fall, meaning you went to an era after my fall, right? Yes, indeed, you're very smart, Lynn sincerely complimented before continuing. I went back to the era of the 4 Emperors' War. TCH. Hearing this expected result, Mediche clicked his tongue, not knowing whether to feel disappointed or regretful. Although I couldn't rescue you directly, I did get back at them for you, Lynn continued, sharing his joy with Mediche. I blew up Amon, making him feel pain equivalent to having 1/3 of his time worms repeatedly killed, and turned him into a child. Upon hearing this, the corners of Medice's mouth lifted a bit. Not only that, but his aura, which had been agitated due to Alice de Tudor, also calmed down a lot, clearly showing that his mood had improved significantly. This is not surprising. As the former caretaker of the mischievous child, who genuinely raised Amon, Mediche had suffered countless times at Amon's hands and had long wanted to punish this brat. Hearing today that this brat got his comeuppance at the hands of an even brattier brat, how could Mediche not be happy? Lynn naturally noticed Medice's mood change and immediately struck while the iron was hot. Not to mention, Amon truly lives up to his name. After turning into a child, he tried to use this advantage to make me soft-hearted and almost succeeded. But luckily, at the critical moment, I thought of you, who gets beaten by me every day, and suddenly, Amon's child attack didn't seem like much. End of chapter. Medice's recently uplifted smile froze instantly as a flood of memories poured into his mind. In these memories, he was being beaten up by Lynn every 3 days and severely every 5 days. His unkind brother was indeed showing Mediche what it meant to be nicknamed Amon Jr. Desbel's second epic curse. Mediche almost instinctively cursed in his heart. He sometimes felt that he must have had terrible luck for several lifetimes to end up with these two little bastards. Amon and Lynn. Be confident, Red, maybe in your past life, you destroyed the universe. Lynn said abruptly, as usual, using his sharpness for sarcasm. Hey, it seems someone is quite self-aware. Mediche sneered, but then stiffened because he suddenly realized that he had long been influenced by the other party. Otherwise, how could his language habits and thinking processes be mixed with the commonly used terms and descriptions of the other? This realization made Mediche frown instinctively, just as the young man in front of him smiled and said, "By the way, not only did I beat Amon several times for you, but I also gave Tudor a good thrashing." Hearing this, Mediche couldn't care about the previous issue. He suddenly looked at Lynn and confirmed, "You beat Tudor." "Yes, Amon can testify to that. Later, when I bring Bethel back, he can testify too. Oh, and little Antigo, when he escapes his current madness and returns to being a miracle invoker, he can testify as well," Lynn said with a smile, suddenly much happier because of recalling a pleasant memory. Medice's expression turned subtle instantly. He did not doubt the truth of Lynn's words. There was no need for the other party to lie about something so easily disproved, and strictly speaking, such a lie would not benefit the other party much. What surprised Medice was that Lynn would do this for him, to beat up Tudor. Medice knew very well that although the other party could use some powerful force at critical moments, Lynn obviously did not like that kind of power. In fact, that power was likely harmful to Lynn himself, pushing him closer to divinity and affecting his humanity. This was Medice's postulation based on memories. As a top-level schemer, his mind was indeed excellent, much better than his unkind brother. This was probably also why, even though Lynn was strong enough to crush anyone in the world, he usually only used the abilities of a sage. Lynn actually did not like using that power, even though it was his trump card, even though it made him nearly invincible in this world. Medice saw this clearly. His unkind brother, although in some sense more of a troublemaker than Amon, actually valued his humanity a lot and was always careful to maintain it. If someone else had Lynn's power, they would not care whether it eroded their humanity. Many have lost their humanity and sanity for the sake of ascension, with Tudor being the best example. Because of this, Medice was so surprised. In his judgment, Lynn should not do such a thing for him, as it would damage the humanity he carefully maintained. But Lynn did it anyway. Then he came to share the joy of this event with him. Although Medice was momentarily speechless, he looked at Lynn, slightly lowering his gaze. A few seconds later, he suddenly chuckled and, with blood-red eyes looking at Lynn, said, "Aren't you the one who hates using that power the most? You even beat a sequence 0. What, aren't you afraid of losing yourself?" "Of course, I'm afraid, but I had no choice. Avenging you was more important. After all, I'm a good brother." Lynn shrugged, his smile helpless. "Hey, you should touch your chest when you say that to see if it's still beating." Medice laughed, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Too bad I couldn't see it. Otherwise, I would probably laugh even in my dreams. It is a bit of a pity. How about I weave a dream later, extract this memory, and make a dream so you can personally experience the joy of beating Tudor?" Lynn suddenly had a brilliant idea and promised, "Don't worry, as long as you don't delve into my subconscious, surface dreams are absolutely safe." This was true. Whether out of disguise or some other reason, Lynn's surface information was very safe. Simply put, on the surface, Lynn had dreams and spiritual threads like a normal person. So even a Sequence 7 nightmare could enter his dreams without danger if Lynn allowed it, as long as they didn't try to explore deeper layers of his dreams and consciousness. His spiritual threads were the same. Each of Lynn's identities had spiritual threads that could indeed be controlled by a marionettist, but like Rosago, the surface disguise was just a disguise. Normally, a puppet master could control Lynn's body through his spiritual threads but couldn't control his soul, let alone puppetize him. In other words, if a high-sequence full pathway Beander in the future tried to puppetize Lynn, they would find out, laughably, that it wouldn't work, as the process would always be stuck at the final step. Because of this, Lynn suspected that if an scholar of yore tried to pull out his historical projection, it might work, but the historical projection would just be a normal version of him, not using his unknown powers or unique abilities. But Lynn had a feeling that if someone did pull out his historical projection, it might succeed, but controlling the historical projection would be another matter entirely. Mediche, recalling the fate of the Dragon of Nightmares, was initially hesitant, but his curiosity about Alistair Tudor getting beaten prevailed, so he didn't refuse. He only asked, why could Amon and the others testify? Did you beat Tudor in front of them? Ah, didn't I say? I temporarily turned them against him and beat Tudor with them. Lynn smiled brightly, his confidants instantly became his biggest threats. Mediche instantly understood the meaning of double the joy, unable to hold back his laughter. Ha ha ha. End of chapter. Ha ha ha. Mediche laughed for a long time, clearly showing some emotional instability. If he wasn't in a ghostly state, he would probably have laughed until he cried. During Medice's maniacal laughter, Lynn uncharacteristically remained quiet. He simply watched the hysterical hotpot ghost in front of him, sighed silently, and thought to himself that he hadn't beaten Alistair Tudor enough. Lynn pondered how he would pummel Alistair Tudor the next time he dared to test him. While Lynn was deep in thought, Medice's laughter gradually subsided. The former Angel of War finally calmed down, but he was still in a good mood. He looked at Lynn and, for once, without his usual sarcastic tone, said, "Well done, brother." It was a simple statement, without any hint of sarcasm. Though it was a common phrase in the second epic, hearing, "brother," in the fifth epic was a first. Lynn blinked, snapping out of his reverie. He raised an eyebrow and smiled. Of course, after all, you must have saved the whole cosmos in your past life to have me as your brother in this one. Lynn swiftly contradicted his previous statement without hesitation, showing no shame in doing so. Well, seeing this, Mediche instinctively sneered but didn't argue. Lynn continued to smile, and not only did I beat up Alistair Tudor, but I also extracted a Weather Warlock's characteristic from him. Guess who it's for? His face bore an arrogant, beg me, expression. No guesses. Mediche narrowed his eyes, refusing to play along. As an experienced war angel, he knew that giving Lynn any satisfaction would only inflate his ego further. You're no longer as cute as when you were a child. Back then, you used to beg me so earnestly. Lynn looked at Mediche with feigned disappointment but didn't press the matter further. He then put on a more serious expression. You know, now that I've returned to the War of the Four Emperors period, I have a new plan to save you. Medice's expression turned serious as well. You plan to rescue the version of me from the War of the Four Emperors. As expected, the War Angel quickly grasped Lynn's new plan. Exactly. Smart. Lynn wasn't surprised that his new plan was guessed. He gave Mediche a thumbs up and said leisurely, my plan is simple. I'll give the Weather Warlock's characteristic I took from Alistair Tudor to your past self during the War of the Four Emperors and escort you back to the Solomon Empire. You can recover under the protection of the true Creator, act as their strategist, and when the time is right, eliminate Tudor and reclaim your characteristics. During this process, I will help you. Given the unique circumstances of the War of the Four Emperors and the subsequent Pale disaster, you might even become a god in that era. Lynn paused, his smile fading slightly as he looked at Mediche. I don't like the Pale disaster, nor do I like the god of death and the primordial demoness, and you just happen to need a continent-wide war. For you, the reason for war doesn't matter. Starting a war to end the Pale disaster and protect the northern continent is just as valid, isn't it? Mediche raised an eyebrow at this, then nodded slightly. It is indeed feasible. The Red Priest's promotion ritual only required a continent-wide war and enough victories. The purpose of the war wouldn't affect the ritual's outcome. Lynn's suggestion was entirely workable. Given the scale of the Pale disaster, if Mediche could end it successfully, the ritual would be sufficiently weighty. Lynn then remembered something and added, I'm currently on the Savon pathway, at sequence 2 as a knowledge magister. If all goes well, I'll become an paragon before the god of steam and machinery ascends. Upon hearing this, though Lynn didn't spell it out, Mediche immediately understood his implication, cooperation or mutual assistance. Lynn would help him reclaim his characteristics and rise to the position of Red Priest, and in return, Mediche would help Lynn ascend during the War of the Four Emperors. That won't work on me. I can't influence my past self as you can, Mediche said, resuming his arrogant posture. I know that. I'm just seeking your advice on how to persuade your past self during the War of the Four Emperors, Lynn replied, as one of his divine avatars pulled a chair from the void and placed it behind him. Lynn sat down comfortably and continued, after all, your past self just got turned into Hot Pot. I'm worried he might be extreme and hard to persuade. Starting a fight right away wouldn't be ideal. Though he said this, Lynn's expression seemed to anticipate it. Humph. Mediche rolled his eyes but didn't rebuke, do what you think is best. You don't need me to teach you how to persuade people. True, but I need to boost my credibility. Lynn smiled, so, Red, why don't you tell me some of your darkest secrets to earn the trust of your past self? What a cunning plan, Mediche. Fuck off. Mediche couldn't hold back and spat out the word after a few seconds. Whatever. Lynn pouted, disappointed that he couldn't get any juicy secrets. He then said, so, which plan do you choose? Should I stick to the original and try to change your fate before you become Hot Pot, or should I go with the new plan and help your past self rise during the War of the Four Emperors? I must warn you, I can't control when I'll land before you become Hot Pot, Lynn finished, watching Mediche quietly, not urging him, waiting for his decision. He didn't mind either plan. To Lynn, both had their pros and cons. End of chapter. The original plan could have directly avoided Medice's tragic fate, but there were also some issues. For instance, Lynn was unsure when he could accurately create a Smurf account before Mediche was turned into a Hot Pot. Moreover, Lynn had always had a concern, the original corruption theory of Mediche. Did Adam kill Mediche purely to support Alistair Tudor's rise, or was it because Mediche himself had encountered pollution from an outer god or Sephiroth? There was no clear conclusion in the original. Therefore, Lynn was also uncertain if he would arrive before Mediche was turned into a Hot Pot only to find that Mediche had already been polluted and had to die once. That would be too awkward. Moreover, Lynn glanced at the evil spirit in front of him and sighed slightly. Even if fate would be changed, memories would not, so the pain hadn't really disappeared. Sometimes Lynn wondered whether the preservation of original memories for those who interacted with him was a good or bad thing. As for the new plan, on one hand, Lynn could directly act without blindly waiting. On the other hand, the Hot Pot Mediche could directly attack Alistair Tudor in retaliation, although the old plan also allowed for revenge, avenging before the event and after the event felt different. The biggest advantage of this plan was that Mediche and Lynn could mutually benefit and support each other in becoming gods. Even the true creator, if able to avoid defeat and losing too many anchors, wouldn't have become so insane. Lynn confirmed that the true creator's followers in the Solomon Empire were almost like other true gods' followers, not like in the Fifth Epic, where believing in the true creator meant listening to his rap. This was probably because in the Fourth Epic, the true creator had sufficient belief and anchors, thus could still restrain himself, not being so crazy. A not-so-crazy true creator might lay a good foundation for saving Saucereer, although Lynn hadn't figured out how to save Saucereer yet. Of course, the new plan also had drawbacks. The biggest drawback was the risk of failure. Even Lynn couldn't guarantee 100% that he could elevate Mediche to sequence 0 and become a god himself. And this would make Medice's Hot Pot event a true history, because Lynn wouldn't execute the old plan after choosing the new one, making his efforts futile and causing many unforeseeable situations. Lynn didn't like that, so, what would you choose? Lynn thought this as he saw Mediche looking at him with a gaze as if he were an idiot. Mediche hadn't thought about this question for long, almost deciding within 3 seconds. Lynn, are you really brainless? Your head is full of shit. Medice's opening was a familiar taunt, making Lynn's fist harden immediately. Stop. Don't answer yet, let me beat you up first. Lynn raised his fist, showing a bright smile to the former war angel, but his words were as cold as Arctic snow, because I find you really annoying today, Mediche. Medice's taunting smile stiffened. Then, Mediche was indeed beaten up. Even though he absorbed power from the spirit world, making his overall strength barely comparable to Sequence 4, the former war angel obviously couldn't beat a Sequence 2. After his routine beating of his younger brother, Lynn felt refreshed. He pretended to wipe his clean hands on Mediche, then hypocritically said, "Are you all right, Mediche? Do you need me to use some healing abilities?" His crocodile tears made it seem as if he hadn't just beaten Mediche. Fuck off. Mediche slapped his hand away, the former war angel clearly not easily subdued. He had to bow under the eaves but retorted, I choose your new plan. Blood humiliation can only be repaid with blood. Killing an ignorant Alistair Tudor means nothing. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, that's my style. That's indeed your choice. Lynn skillfully ignored Medice's look that said, I'll beat you up sooner or later, and sat back in his chair, saying, in that case, I'll head to find you in the 4th epic. The delivery should arrive soon, remember to sign for it. As Lynn said this, his 4th epic self indeed touched the familiar underground building entrance. It was a seemingly abandoned underground building similar to the one in the 5th epic, except the house above was inhabited. Whether the people were later moved in or placed there by Alistair Tudor was unknown. Backland still belonged to the Night Emperor at this time. Lynn didn't care about this question, just as he didn't care if the air at this time had already grown Adam, or even added 99% concentration of Amon. Lynn didn't care. He just looked at the residents in the house, snapped his fingers lightly, and smoothly entered the familiar building without anyone noticing. Then he saw the familiar high-backed chair and the familiar hotpot evil spirit. Yo, Mediche, you're in quite a sorry state. Unlike the first time seeing the evil spirit version of Mediche in the 5th epic, the now vastly different Lynn not only didn't feel sad but also smiled and greeted. On the high-backed chair, the 4th epic Mediche looked up, his gaze falling on the young angel not far away. He was obviously stunned for a moment. A few seconds later, as if coming back to his senses, he looked at Lynn with a provocative smile, saying, You don't look sorry, but after all these years, you haven't made any progress ascending. It seems like you're eating your meals off the dirt. Obviously mocking Lynn for being worthless apart from his looks. Thank you for the compliment. I know I'm handsome. Lynn was not angry at all, responding calmly, then sat in front of Mediche, examining this Mediche from the 4 Emperors' War period. Mediche was more mature than in the 2nd epic and more vulnerable than in the 5th epic. He still possessed madness and malice but seemed less numb and hysterical, more vibrant and sharp. Clearly, this Mediche, who had recently become an evil spirit, was more energetic than the one in the 5th epic who had been lonely in the underground building for 1,000 years. This was very normal. End of chapter.